Hello and welcome, I'm Mr.Zooiii, and today we're journeying back to the heart of the medieval Middle East to explore the story of an empire forged in the crucible of the Crusades, the Ayyubid Empire. Founded by the legendary Salah ad-Din, or Saladin as he's known in the West, this powerful dynasty once stretched from Egypt across the Levant, a formidable force that recaptured Jerusalem and reshaped the political and religious landscape of the era. Saladin's name still echoes through history, a symbol of chivalry and military genius, but the empire he built, despite its glorious beginnings, was not destined to last indefinitely. Its foundations, strong as they seemed, eventually began to crumble under a multitude of pressures. The Ayyubids, at their zenith, controlled vital trade routes, boasted magnificent cities, and fostered a vibrant culture. They were the champions of Sunni Islam against the Crusader states and internal rivals. Yet within a relatively short span after Saladin's death, this mighty edifice began to show cracks leading to its eventual fragmentation and absorption by new, rising powers. The story of its decline is a fascinating if complex tapestry woven from threads of internal ambition, external aggression, and the shifting sands of power that characterize so much of history. It's a stark reminder that even the greatest empires can falter. In this video, we're going to delve deep into the reasons behind this dramatic reversal of fortune. We'll be breaking down the 6 principal factors that contributed to the collapse of the Ayyubid Empire, examining how Saladin's own decisions played a role and how new forces rose to challenge and ultimately supplant his heirs. From internal squabbles to the devastating Mongol hordes and the relentless pressure of the Crusaders, it's a story filled with intrigue, conflict, and profound historical lessons. So let's begin to unravel the legacy of Saladin and discover why his great empire ultimately fell. The first critical factor in the Ayyubid decline, perhaps ironically, stems directly from Saladin himself and the arrangements he made for his succession. Upon his death in 1193, Saladin, in keeping with a common practice of the time but one fraught with peril, chose to divide his vast territories among his sons and other male relatives. His intention might have been to provide for his family and ensure regional stability by placing trusted kin in charge of different provinces, Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, and other key areas. However, this act of parceling out an empire that had been unified under his singular charismatic leadership essentially created multiple, semi-autonomous power centers from the outset. Each ruler, while nominally part of a larger Ayyubid confederation, naturally began to prioritize the interests of their own domain. This division immediately sowed the seeds of discord. What was perhaps envisioned as a cooperative familial rule quickly devolved into a hotbed of rivalries and internecine struggles. Saladin's sons, brothers, and nephews, each ruling their own segment of the empire, often viewed each other more as competitors than as allies. They vied for supremacy, for control of wealthier territories, or for the prestigious title of overall sultan. This infighting wasn't just occasional, it became a recurring feature of Ayyubid politics for decades. Alliances would shift, brothers would war against brothers, and uncles against nephews, all seeking to expand their own power base at the expense of their relatives. This constant internal strife drained resources, diverted attention from external threats, and eroded any sense of collective Ayyubid identity and purpose. The most significant consequence of this fragmentation was the conspicuous lack of unifying leadership that had characterized Saladin's reign. Saladin had been the linchpin, the figure who could command loyalty and coordinate the efforts of disparate military factions against common enemies like the Crusaders. Without him, and with his successors often more focused on their internal squabbles, the empire lacked a strong central guiding hand. There was no single figure who could consistently galvanize the various Ayyubid principalities into a cohesive unit. This power vacuum at the very top made the empire vulnerable, not just to ambitious relatives, but to the major external challenges that were on the horizon. The legacy of division proved to be a heavy burden for the Ayyubids to bear. The second major element contributing to the Ayyubid downfall was the rise of a unique military institution that the Ayyubids themselves had cultivated, the Mamluks. The Mamluks, whose name literally means owned or slave, were predominantly Kipchak Turk and Circassian slave soldiers, purchased as boys, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained in elite military corps. The Ayyubids, like other Islamic dynasties before them, relied heavily on these Mamluk regiments as the backbone of their armies. They were prized for their loyalty, which was theoretically to their master the Sultan, rather than to tribal or familial affiliations, and for their exceptional martial skills. This reliance, however, proved to be a double-edged sword, a dangerous dependency that would ultimately backfire in spectacular fashion. Over time, particularly in Egypt, the Ayyubid heartland, the Mamluks grew immensely powerful. They weren't just soldiers, they became commanders, governors, and influential figures at court. Ayyubid sultans, especially weaker ones embroiled in the dynastic disputes we've just discussed, often depended on specific Mamluk factions for their own power and survival. This gave Mamluk emirs, or commanders, enormous leverage. They accumulated wealth, estates, and their own loyal followings within the Mamluk system. A distinct Mamluk identity and corporate interest began to form, transcending their loyalty to individual Ayyubid rulers. They saw themselves as the true guardians of the state and of Islam, especially as Ayyubid infighting persisted. The inevitable tipping point arrived in 1250. Following the death of the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih Ayyub during the 7th Crusades invasion of Egypt, and a brief troubled rule by his son Turanshah, the Mamluk emirs seized power directly. Figures like Aybak and Qutuz, leading powerful Mamluk factions, orchestrated a coup, effectively ending Ayyubid rule in Egypt, their most vital province. They established their own Mamluk Sultanate, a regime that would rule Egypt and Syria for centuries. The very military force designed to protect the Ayyubid state had consumed it from within, a stark illustration of how power dynamics can shift when a ruling dynasty becomes overly reliant on a militarized elite. As if internal divisions and the rise of the Mamluks weren't enough, the Ayyubid world was about to be shaken to its core by an unprecedented external threat from the east, the Mongol invasions. In the mid-13th century, the Mongol Empire, under the successors of Genghis Khan, was a terrifying and seemingly unstoppable force, carving out the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their westward expansion brought them inexorably towards the heartlands of the Islamic world, including the territories still held by various Ayyubid princes, particularly in Syria and Mesopotamia. The speed, brutality, and sheer scale of the Mongol conquests struck fear into the hearts of all who lay in their path. The year 1258 stands as a particularly grim milestone. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, led his Mongol hordes to sack Baghdad, the historic capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. This was an event of cataclysmic proportions, not just for its sheer destruction and loss of life, but for its psychological impact on the Muslim world. The caliph was killed, and a center of Islamic learning and culture was devastated. Following this, the Mongol armies pushed further west, directly threatening the remaining Ayyubid principalities in Syria. Cities like Aleppo and Damascus found themselves on the front line, facing an enemy whose reputation for annihilation preceded them. The Ayyubid rulers, already fragmented and weakened, struggled to formulate any kind of unified or effective response to this existential threat. Crucially, it was the newly established Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, not the remaining Ayyubid factions, that rose to become the primary defenders of Islam against the Mongol tide in the Levant. In 1260, at the pivotal Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine, the Mamluk forces under Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars achieved a historic victory, halting the Mongol advance. This victory was immensely significant. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and positioned the Mamluks as the new champions of the Islamic world. The Ayyubids, by contrast, were increasingly seen as ineffective, unable to protect their own territories or the wider Muslim community from this devastating new power. The Mongol storm had irrevocably altered the political landscape, further marginalizing the already struggling Ayyubid dynasty. While the Mongol invasions represented a new and terrifying threat, the Ayyubids were simultaneously contending with a much older, more persistent adversary, the Crusader states established along the Levantine coast. Even after Saladin's great victories, including the monumental recapture of Jerusalem, the Crusader presence had not been entirely eradicated. Remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem clung to coastal cities like Acre, Tyre, and Tripoli, and new crusades continued to be launched from Europe, albeit with varying degrees of success. This ongoing conflict was a constant drain on Ayyubid resources, manpower, and attention, stretching for generations and shaping the dynasty's fortunes. The wars against the Crusaders were not just a matter of occasional major campaigns, they involved frequent skirmishes, sieges, raids, and the need to maintain costly garrisons and fortifications along a volatile frontier. This continuous state of warfare diverted funds and soldiers that could have been used to consolidate power internally, develop infrastructure, or address other emerging threats. Each new crusade, such as the Fifth Crusade which targeted Egypt, or the Seventh Crusade led by Louis IX of France, required a massive mobilization of Ayyubid forces, even if the Ayyubids were ultimately successful in repelling them. The economic and human cost of this protracted struggle was substantial, and undoubtedly contributed to the weakening of the Ayyubid state over time. Furthermore, the Crusader presence often exacerbated the internal divisions within the Ayyubid family. Facing pressure from the Franks, individual Ayyubid princes ruling different territories in Syria or Palestine sometimes found it expedient to negotiate separate truces or even temporary alliances with Crusader leaders to protect their own specific domains. This was particularly true when they were also engaged in conflicts with their Ayyubid relatives. Such independent dealings undermined any semblance of a unified Ayyubid foreign policy and played into the hands of the Crusaders, who could exploit these internal rivalries. The constant need to manage the Crusader threat therefore not only drained resources but also further fragmented the Ayyubid political landscape, making a cohesive imperial strategy increasingly difficult to maintain. The initial fragmentation of the empire after Saladin's death, which we've already discussed, wasn't just a temporary phase. It set in motion a long-term decline in central authority that plagued the Ayyubid dynasty throughout its existence. Without a consistently strong, overriding figure like Saladin, the various emirs and princes who ruled their respective territories increasingly acted as independent sovereigns. While a nominal senior Ayyubid sultan, often based in Egypt or Damascus, might claim suzerainty, their actual ability to enforce their will, collect taxes effectively across all regions, or coordinate a unified policy became progressively weaker. This decentralized administrative structure made the empire unwieldy and prone to internal dysfunction. This problem was compounded by inconsistent and often short-lived leadership within the various Ayyubid principalities. Succession was frequently contested, leading to more internal strife and instability. The reigns of many Ayyubid rulers were marked by challenges from ambitious relatives, coups, or the need to constantly negotiate for support among powerful military factions, including the increasingly influential Mamluks. This lack of continuity and strong governance at both the regional and, when it existed, the supra-regional level, meant that long-term planning, investment in infrastructure, and the consistent application of justice and administration suffered. The focus was too often on short-term survival and consolidating one's own precarious position rather than on the health of the empire as a whole. Underpinning these political issues was a growing economic weakness. The constant warfare against Crusaders, Mongols, and indeed amongst themselves was incredibly expensive. Armies needed to be paid, fortifications maintained, and campaigns funded. These conflicts also disrupted vital trade routes that passed through Ayyubid lands, a key source of their wealth. Raids and invasions led to the destruction of agricultural land and the displacement of populations, further impacting productivity and tax revenues. While the early Ayyubid period saw prosperity, the later decades were likely marked by increasing economic strain, reducing the state's capacity to govern effectively, project power, and respond to the mounting crises it faced. The culmination of all these pressures, internal divisions, the Mamluk ascendancy, Mongol invasions, Crusader wars, and systemic weaknesses, led to the critical loss of the Ayyubids' most important territories, Egypt and Syria. Egypt, with its fertile Nile Valley, dense population, and strategic position, had always been the powerhouse of the Ayyubid Empire. It was the richest province, the primary recruitment ground for its armies, and the seat of its most powerful sultans. Therefore, the Mamluk takeover of Egypt in 1250 wasn't just the loss of a province, it was a mortal blow to the Ayyubid dynasty as a major imperial force. Without Egypt, the remaining Ayyubid rulers were significantly diminished in wealth, prestige, and military capability. Following the loss of Egypt, the Ayyubid principalities in Syria found themselves in an increasingly precarious position, squeezed between the aggressive Mamluk Sultanate to the south and the terrifying Mongol threat from the east and north. Some Ayyubid emirs tried to navigate this treacherous geopolitical landscape by allying with one power against the other, or by seeking vassal status under either the Mamluks or, briefly, the Mongols. However, these were desperate measures that only underscored their declining autonomy. Over the subsequent decades, the Mamluks, having established their dominance after Ain Jalut, systematically extended their control over most of Syria, either through direct conquest or by reducing Ayyubid rulers to insignificant local governors under Mamluk suzerainty. By the latter half of the 13th century and into the early 14th century, the Ayyubid Empire as a significant political entity had ceased to exist. While a few minor Ayyubid dynasties clung on to power in small, isolated pockets like Hama or Hizn Kaifa for a while longer, they were essentially local princelings with no real influence on the wider stage. They were remnants, echoes of a once great empire now overshadowed and largely controlled by the Mamluks. The grand imperial project initiated by Saladin had unraveled, leaving his descendants as minor players in a world dominated by new, more dynamic powers. The loss of their core territories of Egypt and Syria marked the effective end of the Ayyubid age. So, as we've seen, the collapse of the Ayyubid Empire wasn't the result of a single fatal blow, but rather a complex tapestry of interwoven factors. Saladin's decision to divide his realm, while perhaps understandable in its context, undeniably sowed the seeds of internal disunity that plagued his successors. This was compounded by the rise of the very Mamluk soldiers they relied upon, who ultimately usurped their power in the empire's Egyptian heartland. Add to this the relentless pressure from the Crusader states, a constant drain on resources and a source of political fragmentation, and the devastating wave of Mongol invasions that reshaped the entire region, and the picture becomes clear. The decline of central authority and underlying economic weaknesses further eroded the Ayyubids' ability to withstand these immense pressures. What Saladin had built through singular vision and military prowess proved difficult for his descendants to maintain amidst their own rivalries and the seismic shifts occurring around them. The loss of Egypt to the Mamluks, followed by the gradual absorption or subjugation of their Syrian territories by Mamluks and Mongols, effectively marked the end of the Ayyubids as a major power. Their story is a powerful reminder of the fragility of empires and how internal vulnerabilities can be fatally exploited by external forces. The Ayyubid legacy, however, is more than just a story of decline. It's a period that profoundly shaped the Middle East, and its echoes can still be found in the culture, architecture, and political memory of the region. But which of these factors do you think was the most decisive in their downfall? Was it the internal fractures, the Mamluk betrayal, the Mongol hammer blow, or something else entirely? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for joining me, Mr.Zooiii, on this historical journey. If you enjoyed this video, please do like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more explorations of the past.